Stalled.
On the morning of June 1st, 2009, anxious friends and relatives of passengers on Air France Flight 447 gathered at Paris's Charles de Gaulle International Airport. Rumours were spreading that an Air France A330 from Rio to Paris had disappeared from radar while crossing the Atlantic in the early hours of the morning. The last voice contact with the aircraft was at 1:35 am, 3 hours and 6 minutes after the flight had departed from Rio. Emotions were running high as the scheduled arrival time of 11 am came and went, and in the hours that followed, an Air France spokesperson would confirm everyone's worst fears. The aircraft was presumed crashed somewhere over the Atlantic with 228 people on board. 2 days later, the Brazilian Navy would discover the first parts of wreckage floating on the ocean's surface around 500 miles east of the northeastern coast of Brazil. In the days that followed, efforts would be made to retrieve wreckage and debris and locate the aircraft's 2 flight deck recorders. However, despite best efforts, the 2 flight deck recorders would remain elusive for almost 2 years. The Airbus A330 was a modern, highly sophisticated aircraft, and even though the 2 flight deck recorders could not be found, the aircraft itself had offered investigators some valuable insights into the last couple of minutes of Flight 447. Air France had equipped its A330 fleet with a system known as ACARS, or Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System. The system was capable of sending automated transmissions via VHF or satellite back to Air France headquarters. The ACARS system would send back position reports approximately every 10 minutes, along with being able to transmit various system error reports as well. In the final 5 minutes of Flight 447, the ACARS system on board the doomed A330 had sent 5 error reports and 19 warnings back to Air France maintenance headquarters. At 2:10 am, the first of these automated transmissions was sent, the first indicating an error with the plane's pitot tubes. The pitot tubes are small sensors on the outside of the aircraft that measure the plane's airspeed. Other warnings with the same timestamp indicated the aircraft's autopilot and auto-thrust systems had disengaged. Over the final 3 minutes of the flight, several other warnings were transmitted, including one indicating there was a disagreement between 3 separate air data systems. And at 2:14 am, in the flight's final minute, a cabin vertical speed warning was transmitted, indicating the aircraft was in a rapid descent. These series of warnings were all accident investigators had to work with for almost 2 years. Several theories were being thrown around as to the cause of the accident, including doubt being shrouded upon Airbus's renowned fly-by-wire system itself. The highly automated system had been the centre of a few high-profile incidents in the past, including one the previous year when another A330 had left pilots wrestling for control of their aircraft when the onboard computers made a series of violent maneuvers after some faulty sensors fed the aircraft incorrect data, leading to a number of severe injuries as some passengers were thrown against the cabin ceiling. After an exhaustive search of the ocean's floor spanning almost 2 years, the final resting place of Air France Flight 447 was located. The debris field was quite compact in an area just 200 by 600 meters. The wreckage site included parts of the wings, engines, landing gear, 104 bodies, some still strapped in their seats, and the aircraft's flight data recorder and flight deck voice recorder. On May the 7th, the 2 flight recorders were taken aboard a French naval vessel and transported back to France. By late May of 2011, the data of both devices had been downloaded and their contents would be analysed over the following weeks. The flight deck voice recorder revealed a harrowing final 4 minutes of Air France Flight 447 and asked questions of crew proficiency in the days of highly automated aircraft. The next part of this video will explain exactly what happened on that fateful night. At 22:29 UTC or 7:29 PM local time on the 31st of May 2009, Air France Flight 447 from Rio to Paris took off carrying 216 passengers and 12 crew. captaining the flight was 58-year-old Marc Dubois, who had more than 10,000 flying hours, including 1,700 in the Airbus A330. He had been working with the airline for more than 20 years. The first officer for the evening's flight was 32-year-old Pierre-Cédric Bonnard. He was the least experienced of the three pilots on board, with just over 2,900 flying hours, of which only 800 were in the Airbus A330. His wife Isabelle had joined him for the trip to Brazil and was a passenger on the evening's flight. The third pilot was First Officer 37-year-old David Robier, who would be acting as relief pilot for the evening's flight. He joined Air France in 1998 and had over 6,500 flying hours, of which nearly 4,500 were in the Airbus A330. He would begin the evening's flight on rest, then relieve the other two pilots later in the flight. The route for the evening's flight would take Flight 447 north up the East Brazilian coast, before heading out over the Atlantic Ocean, then up the West African coast, and then on to Paris. At 1:35 am, the crew of Flight 447 would send their final voice message to air traffic control, a positional report letting air traffic control know they had reached waypoint Intel, approximately 340 miles east of Natal off the northeast coast of Brazil. From there, the aircraft would enter a radar dead zone and would not be expected to show on radar again until reaching the coast off Senegal. As the aircraft reached the equator, they would enter an area known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone. The Intertropical Convergence Zone is a belt of low pressure that circles the Earth near the equator, where the winds of the northern and southern hemispheres come together. The area is synonymous with storm and weather patterns hazardous to aircraft. Some of the strongest winds on the Earth have been recorded in these storms, and thunder with heavy lightning is also common. On the night of the crash, large thunderstorms were forecasted in the area. It is standard operating procedure for pilots to navigate the aircraft around these storms, and other aircrafts in the vicinity had done just that on the night of the accident. But for reasons that will be forever unknown to investigators, the pilots of Air France Flight 447 made only minor adjustments to their course and largely continued to fly the aircraft into the upcoming thunderstorms. At around 1:55 am, Captain Dubois wakes First Officer Robier, who, up until this point, has been resting in the crew rest area behind the flight deck. Despite the looming thunderstorms ahead, Captain Dubois intends to go ahead with his break. Before Dubois goes on his break, he establishes that Bonnard in the right-hand seat will be the pilot in command until he returns from his break, and the more experienced Robier will act as the co-pilot from the left-hand seat. The captain left for his break at 2:01 am. The weather outside began to deteriorate shortly after, and the aircraft experienced some minor turbulence. Bonnard, flying the plane, called the flight attendants to warn them of expected turbulence, and advised them that he would let them know when they had cleared the bad weather. The plane at this point began to encounter icy conditions. The flight deck voice recorder picks up what investigators believe was the sound of hail hitting the outside of the aircraft. Moments later, at 2:10 am, the aircraft's speed sensors, known as Pitot Tubes, became blocked with ice, which meant that the aircraft's systems no longer knew the correct speed in which the aircraft was travelling. As a result of the now unreliable data being fed to the aircraft, the autopilot system automatically disengaged, handing control of the aircraft over to the pilots. 3 seconds later, the autothrust system would disengage too. As the pilot in command, Bonnard would formally acknowledge he had control of the aircraft by saying, "I have the controls." Although it was not an ideal situation for the pilots not knowing the speed of the aircraft due to the blocked speed sensors, it was by no means a critical situation. There is procedure for maintaining straight and level flight with reference to thrust settings and pitch attitudes. This would have allowed for a stabilization of the flight path while further diagnostics were completed to identify and rectify the issue. First Officer Robier sounded the crew call bell to summon Captain Dubois back from the crew rest area behind the flight deck. The outside weather conditions would cause the aircraft to bank slightly to the right, which resulted in an almost panicked reaction from Bonnard, who was flying the plane. He responded by overcorrecting the aircraft by pushing his side stick hard to the left. The Airbus flight deck has 2 side sticks, one for each pilot. When you pull back, the aircraft's nose will pitch up, causing the plane to climb. Push the side stick forward, and the aircraft's nose will pitch down and the aircraft will start to descend. At this time, the aircraft was showing a faulty reading which indicated they had lost around 400 feet. Although the plane's instruments were giving incorrect readings due to the iced up sensors, it appears Bernard trusted them and began to pull hard back on his side stick to regain the altitude he believed his aircraft had lost. As a result of Bernard pulling back so hard on his side stick, the aircraft began to climb at a rapid rate, at one point climbing at a rate as high as 7,000 feet per minute. Initially, the aircraft kept climbing, reaching its highest altitude of 38,000 feet. At this time, one of the aircraft's pitot tubes comes back online, giving one of the aircraft's airspeed indicators an accurate reading of the airspeed. However, it appears Bernard did not trust the information he was getting and in fact believed they were overspeeding when in reality they were travelling dangerously slow. The aircraft's stall warning began to sound in the flight deck, warning the pilots the aircraft was travelling dangerously slow and was now beginning to lose altitude. When an aircraft stalls, the standard protocol is to push the nose down, apply more power, and get sufficient airflow over the wings to regain sufficient lift. However, it appears on Flight 447 that Bernard, despite the stall warnings, did not believe his aircraft was stalling, and unbeknown to Robier, sitting in the left-hand seat, Bernard continued to pull hard back on his side stick, putting the aircraft into an even deeper stall. At this time, Captain Marc Dubois returns to the flight deck around 1 minute after being summoned. He takes the jump seat behind the younger two first officers controlling the plane. They explain that they have lost control of the aircraft and have no reliable data. The aircraft was rapidly dropping at a rate of around 15,000 feet per minute, with its nose pitched high up. Bernard, still convinced the aircraft is travelling too fast, applies the air brakes, to which the more experienced Robier shouts no and overrides him. Robier asks for control of the plane without issuing the formal acknowledgement. Believing he is now flying the aircraft, Robier focuses on trying to level out the wings and attempts to get the nose to pitch down. He is still unaware that the inexperienced Bernard continues to pull hard back on his side stick, keeping the aircraft's nose pitched up, further reducing their speed and keeping the plane in a deep stall. Just 3 short minutes earlier, Air France Flight 447 had been flying along straight and level at 35,000 feet. Now at just 7,000 feet above the ocean's surface, with its nose pitched up high, falling at a rate of 15,000 feet per minute, First Officer Robier pleads with the aircraft to climb. In response, the younger, inexperienced Bernard informs the others that he has had his side stick pulled back hard the whole time. This was the moment that the other two pilots finally knew why the aircraft was doing what it was doing. Captain Dubois, sitting in the jump seat behind his two younger first officers, begins yelling, "No, don't go up." Now, at just 5,000 feet above the ocean's surface, First Officer Robier, in the left-hand seat, demands control off of Bernard. He immediately attempts to push the nose of the aircraft down to gain speed and get airflow over the wings in an attempt to get the aircraft out of the stall. Captain Dubois warns the crew they are still pitching up. First Officer Robier seems to question this confused, as he was clearly pushing forward on his side stick. Bernard said, "Well, we have to, we're at 4,000 feet. Unbeknown to the other two pilots, Bernard had once again in panic begun pulling back on his side stick. Moments later, at 2,000 feet, the aircraft detected the ocean's surface below them and the ground proximity alert began sounding. At this point, Captain Dubois, almost sounding like he knew it was all over, said, "Go on, pull up," most likely knowing there was no point as the aircraft had no speed and no chance of climbing. At 2:14 AM, Air France Flight 447 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, belly first, killing all 228 people on board. In 2012, 3 years after the accident, the BEA released its final report on the cause of the accident. The initial summary of the cause of the accident is as follows. Temporary inconsistency between the measured speeds, likely as a result of the obstruction of the pitot tubes by ice crystals, caused autopilot disconnection and reconfiguration to alternate law. The crew made inappropriate control inputs that destabilized the flight path. The crew failed to follow appropriate procedure for loss of displayed airspeed information. The crew were late to identify and correcting the deviation from the flight path. The crew lacked understanding of the approach to stall. and the crew failed to recognize the aircraft had stalled, and consequently did not make inputs that would have made recovery from the stall possible. Thanks for watching. I hope you have enjoyed learning about one of the most famous air crashes in recent history. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing to my channel.